The private jet shimmered under the golden afternoon light like an emerald jewel resting atop the cold grey concrete of a private airfield in New York. Rows of luxurious brown leather seats stitched with gold-threaded trim reflected the sunlight with subtle elegance, evoking a sense of exclusivity not meant for everyone. The cabin air carried faint hints of sandalwood and expensive champagne. This was not a place for confusion. And then the cabin door opened. A 40-year-old black woman stepped in with a slow, confident gait. Her navy blue tailored suit wasn't flashy, but every line radiated precision and class. She didn't need to speak for those with a keen eye. It was clear this wasn't an ordinary passenger. But keen eye was a gift not everyone possessed. The lead flight attendant, Heather Collins, stood by the entrance in a form-fitting uniform, her hair neatly tied without a strand out of place. She flashed a bright smile at a white businessman behind the woman, bowing slightly and cooing sweetly. "Welcome back, Mr. Whitaker. Your usual seat is ready." But when it was the black woman's turn, that smile vanished. All that remained was a curt nod, "Hello." No eye contact, no warmth, nothing but professional coldness masquerading as polite formality. The woman didn't flinch. She nodded softly, then continued walking into the cabin, as if she had lived with these invisible yardsticks her entire life. Inside the cabin was wrapped in the silence of wealth. A blonde woman was knitting beside her husband, who read the financial section. They looked up as Alicia passed, nothing overt, just a glance, before lowering their eyes as though she were invisible. Alicia Monroe, that black woman, said nothing. She placed her compact handbag neatly beneath the seat and took her place in seat 2A next to the window facing the runway. She checked her seatbelt, pulled out a book, and waited. No one knew who she was. And perhaps that was precisely why it all began. Heather walked down the aisle, checking each passenger, smiling at Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker, even squeezing the woman's hand like an old friend. But when she reached Alicia, she stopped. Her eyes scanned the black leather bag beneath the seat. It was genuine leather, with no luxury logos. Heather's lips curled slightly, and this time, she came to a complete halt. "Ma'am, you may be in the wrong seat." Her tone was polite, but something in how she emphasized the word wrong chilled the air. Alicia looked up, calm. "I don't think so. My seat is 2A. Heather tilted her head slightly as if she had just heard a joke. "This seat is reserved for elite passengers. Perhaps you should check with your actual seat." She said this without glancing at a manifest, her eyes drifting down to Alicia's suit like she was inspecting a knockoff. Alicia set her book aside. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. "Maybe you should check the manifest before making assumptions." The cabin was still quiet, but a few eyes drifted their way. A curly-haired woman across the aisle whispered something to her husband. A businessman seated nearby, Marcus Bennett, looked directly at Alicia, his gaze quiet but intent. Heather clasped her hands behind her back, eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't need to check. I know who belongs in this cabin and who doesn't." The word "belongs" cut like a blade. It didn't need to be shouted for its meaning to be clear. Alicia met Heather's gaze. She wasn't angry, just carried the calm disappointment of someone who'd seen this before. She said nothing. Heather leaned in, lowering her voice like she offered a gentle suggestion. "If you don't move to the back, I'll have to call security." And in that moment, Alicia's eyes sharpened. Not with rage, but with unwavering clarity. She said just one sentence. "Call whoever you need. I'm not going anywhere." The air in the cabin thickened as if the pressure had suddenly shifted. What was supposed to be a tranquil luxury cabin on a Monroe Air jet had become a stage for a silent reckoning. There were no microphones, slogans, looks tones, or unspoken choices about who deserved kindness. Still poised outside, Heather Collins showed the strain beneath her surface. She leaned in closer this time, loud enough for those nearby to hear, "I'm trying to maintain order, ma'am. But if you continue to be uncooperative, I'll have to request ground staff to escort you to your proper seat." The phrase proper seat echoed like an ice bucket dumped over the soul of anyone whose skin, instead of their status, had ever defined them. From across the aisle, Marcus Bennett, sharply dressed in a charcoal suit, turned his head slightly. He didn't speak, but his eyes said everything I've seen this before too many times. And indeed, that was the tragedy. Not that it was rare, but it was so painfully familiar. Alicia Monroe remained still. Her hand rested on her thumb, brushing the phone screen. But instead of reacting, she looked at Heather as if she were looking through her and said slowly, "I think the one disrupting order is you." Whispers stirred in the back of the cabin. The curly-haired woman Cheryl Adams, known for appearing at charity galas but allergic to conflict, murmured to her companion, "She's causing a scene. Maybe hoping for a free upgrade." Heather heard it, and as if she'd found her justification, she turned to Alicia, offering a razor-thin smile. "Exactly. Some people think they can bargain their way into what they can't afford." Emily Parker, the young flight attendant standing near the cockpit, tensed. She had seen every word and glance, and her chest tightened. She didn't dare interfere, but her conscience squirmed. Her hands trembled slightly as she glanced at the passenger manifest behind the cockpit. Heather crossed her arms, watching Alicia as if waiting for her to explode. But what came instead was composure. Alicia didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't do what they expected. She sat straighter, and when her eyes locked with Heather's again, what shook Heather wasn't fury. It was unshakable calm. At that moment, a new force entered the cabin's silent division. Some passengers looked at Alicia with empathy, others glanced at Heather suspiciously, and some kept pretending to sleep or stared into their champagne flutes like nothing was happening. Because siding with justice sometimes means stepping out of comfort, and not everyone is ready for that. Heather inhaled deeply, then turned to Emily. "Escort her to the back." Her voice was glacial. Emily didn't move. Heather repeated sharper this time. "I said, take her to the economy cabin." Emily looked at Alicia, her eyes apologetic, and whispered, "Ma'am, would you please?" Alicia tilted her head, her voice low but firm. "You should think carefully before you act." Emily froze. The entire cabin held its breath. Only the distant hum of jet engines remained. Outside, the world was ready for takeoff. Inside, the aircraft had not yet left the ground, because it was stuck in an invisible prejudice. The plane hadn't lifted from the runway, but a storm had begun to form within the cabin. Young flight attendant Emily Parker hesitated, her eyes locking with the powerful gaze of Alicia Monroe. No yelling, no chaos, just one quiet but solid sentence: "You should think carefully before you act." Emily stepped back. Her fingers trembling, she turned toward the passenger list near the cockpit. Just as her hand grazed the clipboard, a sharp voice sliced through the air. "Emily, what do you think you're doing?" It was Heather Collins. She marched forward, voice louder than necessary enough for the whole cabin to hear. "I told you before. Don't let someone like her manipulate your kindness." The entire cabin froze. A few passengers turned away. Some stared down at their laps. But one man, Marcus Bennett, couldn't stay silent. He leaned slightly forward and asked in a low voice, "Ma'am, are you all right?" Alicia turned to him and gave a gentle nod. "I'm fine, thank you." Her calm response felt more like a reply in a business meeting than during a public humiliation. Heather heard it, and she couldn't accept it. "Sir," she turned to Marcus, her voice still polite but laced with warning. "I would appreciate it if you didn't encourage the disruption. We have rules." Marcus raised an eyebrow, responding slowly. "From where I'm sitting, you're causing the disruption." That sentence struck like a punch to Heather's professional facade. Her face flushed red, her eyes blazed. Then she snapped back toward Alicia. "I've been more than patient," she growled. "Will you stop causing trouble, admit you're in the wrong seat, or do I need to remove you from this flight myself?" Alicia remained silent, but her gaze, deep cold and in complete control, completely unraveled Heather's patience. Without warning, without hesitation, the slap cracked through the air like thunder in mid-air. The sound of skin against skin echoed across the cabin. A real slap, hard, undeniable, irrevocable. No one moved. No one spoke. Only Emily stood frozen, her hand covering her mouth. Marcus stood up instantly. Cheryl Adams fell silent, her lipstick dropping from her hand to the floor. Alicia didn't even blink. She didn't touch her face. She didn't retreat. She sat up straighter, her eyes now like a velvet-wrapped blade, not angry, just surgical. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," Alicia said. Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't tremble, but every word felt like iron. Heather gasped, shocked by the response. She had expected Alicia to explode, lash out, and give her a reason to call security. But Alicia stared, like she was piercing through Heather's very identity. There was no longer any doubt in the cabin. The truth needed no explanation. This wasn't about the wrong seat. This wasn't about economy class tickets. This wasn't about someone causing trouble. This was discrimination. Blatant, intentional, and now unmistakable. Heather began backing away, her fingers clenched tightly. You can't threaten me." Alicia tilted her head. "I don't need to threaten. I need the truth. And you've just shown this entire cabin exactly what it looks like." Heather looked around, seeking support, but the surrounding eyes avoided her. Cheryl stared at her lap. Marcus crossed his arms. Emily shifted her gaze as if preventing fire. Heather was alone, she knew it, and the terrifying part was that she didn't realize she was about to lose everything. The cabin sank into silence. No more whispers, no more clicks of seatbelts, not even the background music from the entertainment system. Every sound seemed smothered by the echo of the slap Heather Collins had just landed on a woman she assumed was nobody. But that woman, Alicia Monroe, remained still. Her hand rested on her thigh, steady as stone. Her eyes held no hatred, no pain, just one thing, an icy determination from someone who never needed to scream to be heard. Heather panted, realizing she had crossed a line. But like all those who fall too deep into pride, she tried to justify herself by attacking back. "Are you saying I'll regret this? Who do you think you are? This is a company aircraft. It doesn't belong to you." Alicia tilted her head again, her gaze unwavering. "Are you sure you understand the aircraft you're working on?" That question wasn't a threat. It was a sign, a quiet flare signaling that Heather had crossed a line she didn't even see. Emily Parker, the young flight attendant, still stood frozen. Her hands covered her mouth. Her eyes were fixed on Alicia. But deep inside them, something had changed. Part of it was shock, but the rest was clarity. She knew what she had witnessed. She knew what was wrong. And most importantly, she knew who was right. Emily stepped back quietly, walking toward the cockpit door where the passenger manifest was posted. Her hands trembled as she scanned the names until she stopped at seat 2A. Monroe Alicia, Chief Executive Officer, Monroe Air Group. She reread it, and again, and this time with full awareness and conviction. Emily pulled her phone from her uniform pocket and stepped into a quiet corner of the cabin. Her voice was shaky but firm as she spoke. "Hello, this is Emily Parker, flight attendant on Flight Attendant 83. We have a serious situation." She paused. "Passenger Alicia Monroe is subjected to severe mistreatment by the crew. And yes, it's the Alicia Monroe you're thinking of." Back in the main cabin, Heather still hadn't realized what was happening. She tried to collect herself, smoothing out her uniform, lifting her head to address the passengers. "We will not let disruptive behavior compromise this flight," she declared like an officer struggling to maintain control. But the eyes around her had changed. Marcus Bennett leaned back in his seat, arms crossed, watching her like he awaited her to collapse. Cheryl Adams, the once curious onlooker, was now looking at Alicia with an expression torn between regret and admiration. Alicia remained seated, but now her gaze enveloped the cabin, and for the first time since boarding, everyone began to listen without her having to speak. Slowly, she reached down, opened her bag and pulled out her phone. She typed a few lines. No one could see what she wrote, but Heather, standing only a few steps away, felt an icy shiver crawling up her spine. "What are you doing?" Heather asked, her voice wavering. Alicia didn't look up. "You'll find out soon." The engines began to roar outside the window. The plane was preparing to taxi. But Heather felt something else beneath her feet, not the rumble of jet turbines, but the tremble of standing atop something she didn't understand the weight of. A black woman, publicly insulted, did not scream, did not leave, did not back down. She waited for the right moment to step out of the shadows. Heather stood motionless in the aisle, her tray trembling slightly in her hand. Though she tried to maintain a stern expression, her authority was now only a thin shell cracking by the second. She glanced around the cabin, hoping someone would stand with her, but the silence said everything. Every gaze had turned toward Alicia. Not a word, no one left to defend Heather. Alicia placed her phone on the tray beside her seat. The screen had gone dark, but no one in the cabin could forget the look in her eyes as she sent that message, cold, resolute, and needing no explanation. Every passenger, from the wealthy to the curious, felt one thing: this woman was unafraid. Heather swallowed hard. She couldn't pinpoint what was stirring in her. Was it Alicia's stare or the terrifying silence of the cabin? She was teetering between authority and fear. The harder she gripped the tray, the more she felt herself sinking. At the rear of the cabin, Emily Parker took a small step back. The passenger manifest, still in her hand, bore a name in bold clarity: Monroe Alicia, owner, CEO, Monroe Air Group. Emily said nothing yet, but inside a storm was churning, caught between loyalty, justice, and fear. She knew that speaking up might cost her job, but staying silent would cost her something far more profound. Alicia calmly unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, not hurried, not arrogant, but with a gaze that reached every soul in the cabin. And for the first time, everyone sat up straight. "I've been silent long enough," she said, her voice not loud, but ringing clear. "Just long enough to see who dares to stand for what's right." Silence. Marcus Bennett gave a slight nod. Cheryl Adams lowered her head. Heather took a half step back. "I didn't come here to argue," Alicia continued. "I simply took my assigned seat. But the looks, the words, the attitudes since I boarded this plane were not accidents. They were choices." She turned toward Heather. "And you chose discrimination." Heather stiffened. "You didn't know who I was, and so you thought you could treat me like I had no worth." Alicia smiled, not with contempt, but with the quiet assurance of someone who's seen too much to need to prove anything anymore. "You were right about one thing," Alicia said. "This is a company aircraft." She paused for half a second, then added, "And I'm the one who bought it." The entire cabin froze. Emily stepped forward, her hands shaking, holding out the manifest with a name no one could deny. Heather went pale. For the first time, she realized Alicia hadn't taken the wrong seat. She had been wrong from the start. Heather stood motionless, her face drained of color, then flushed red, then pale again. She looked at Alicia, the woman who had just said the words that turned the entire cabin to ice. "And I'm the one who bought this aircraft." No one clapped, no one cheered, only silence so thick you could hear your heartbeat. Still clutching the manifest, Emily Parker slowly stepped forward, eyes locked on Heather, no longer trembling, no longer unsure. Only one thing remained in her now: truth must stand with what's right. She's telling the truth," Emily said softly. "Her name is at the top of the manifest under owner." Heather snapped toward Emily, her eyes flickering between pleading and rage. "Emily, what are you saying? Are you turning against me?" Emily didn't answer. She didn't need to tell the truth. She never begged for permission. Alicia took one step forward, still wearing the same dark suit, carrying the presence of someone born to lead, not to ask permission. She no longer looked at Heather. She turned to face the entire cabin. Her voice rang out steady and pure. "I sat exactly where I was assigned. But to some of you, I could never be correct because of who I am. Not because I was wrong, but because I didn't look like what you're used to seeing." Cheryl Adams, who had whispered about a free upgrade, now bowed her head, her hands clenched. She couldn't meet Alicia's gaze because she knew she had been part of the silent complicity. Marcus Bennett stood up. He placed a hand over his chest and nodded. He didn't speak, but in his eyes there was a deep respect, not for power, but for how Alicia wielded it. Heather, now in panic, stepped back, then again. Words failed her. Everything around her began to crumble, piece by piece. Not because Alicia shouted, but because Alicia never had to. She just stood there. And when a person's presence alone makes others lower their gaze, that is true power. Alicia looked at Heather one last time. "You didn't see me because you never wanted to. You heard me speak, but you never listened. You thought I didn't matter. And that was your greatest mistake." And then from the cockpit, a pair of footsteps echoed. The captain stepped out. His face was grave. He walked directly to Alicia, stopped before her, and bowed slightly. "Miss Monroe, I've just received confirmation from corporate headquarters. On behalf of this crew, we sincerely apologize for what has happened." Heather turned ghostly white. "No, that's not possible," she whispered. "She's just a passenger." The captain didn't look at her. He said just one line: "She owns this airline." The cabin went utterly silent, and this time there were no dismissive glances, no doubts, only shock and shame. For some, shame for misjudging. For others, shame for staying silent too long. The engine still hummed outside the window, but inside the cabin the atmosphere had shifted entirely. Alicia didn't need to speak again. The captain had confirmed her identity. Now the passengers sat still. No one reached for their phones, no one dared sneak a photo. Everyone knew they were witnessing something much greater than a cabin dispute. This was a public reckoning for something society had long kept hidden: implicit discrimination. Heather stood frozen, as if turned to stone. She had lost control of the cabin long ago, but now she'd lost control of herself. I didn't know," she stammered. "If I had known who she was." Alicia didn't react, and that silence, that undisturbed calm, unmoored Heather most. She wasn't scolded, she wasn't shouted at. She was seen for who she truly was, and that was enough to shatter her pride to ash. The captain leaned in to speak quietly with Alicia. After a few short seconds, he returned to the cockpit. About a minute later, the intercom came on. The captain's voice was calm, deliberate. Ladies and gentlemen, per executive directive from Monroe Air Leadership, we will be making an emergency landing at the nearest airport to address a serious internal violation. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. We appreciate your cooperation. A wave of stunned silence swept through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances. A few turned to look at Alicia as if she had just touched a level of authority they had never imagined. Alicia still said nothing. She sat back down, fastened her seatbelt as if she'd just finished a meeting and was preparing for the next. Heather collapsed into the jump seat, her hand cradling her forehead. Her eyes scanned the cabin, but no one looked at her with sympathy this time. No one believed in the worn-out excuse anymore, "I didn't know." She had once possessed everything: authority, confidence, credibility. But she lacked respect for others when no one was watching. And today it ended. Less than 20 minutes later, the aircraft touched down smoothly at a civilian airport. The runway came into view through the window, warm and inviting, but for Heather it marked the end of a career she once believed untouchable. A black SUV parked beside the red carpet was already waiting on the tarmac. Two staff members in black suits ascended the boarding stairs, composed and focused. "Good afternoon, Ms. Monroe," one said with a bow. "Everything is prepared. We'll escort you to the executive office to begin internal proceedings." The cabin now felt drained entirely of sound. Everyone understood the game was over, but the lesson had only just begun. Heather rose shakily. Please don't destroy me. I didn't know." Alicia turned, not angry, not pitying, just the look of a woman who had endured decades of prejudice and no longer needed anyone to speak for her. "You didn't destroy me because of who I am," Alicia said. "You destroyed yourself because you thought I was nothing." The captain stepped out. "Per protocol, Ms. Collins will now exit the cabin immediately. And someone is waiting for her below." Heather started to move, but a voice rang out from the rear. "You are under arrest for assaulting a passenger." Two airport police officers had arrived at the door. One raised a pair of handcuffs and read her Miranda rights. Heather tried to shout, but her voice was smaller than the cooling engines. Alicia Monroe didn't stand to see her off. She sat there like a true CEO, silent, composed, commanding enough to silence a room without ever raising her voice. She rose from her seat in the aircraft center, like the spine holding the cabin together. No need to raise a hand. No spotlight needed. She wasn't a side character in an onboard dispute. She was the truth everyone had tried to ignore. In the heavy air of guilt and discomfort, she stepped forward. Not rushed, not trembling, unafraid to meet any gaze, even those that had once looked past her as if she didn't exist. Her voice rang out. Not loud, but clear enough to silence every excuse echoing in each passenger's mind. "I will not thank you for your silence." That silence was not an act of kindness. It was the delayed arrival of a realization that should have come much sooner. No one responded. No one dared. Alicia stopped in the aisle, exactly where Heather Collins had once stood, believing she ruled the space. The seat behind her was still warm, but no longer belonged to her. "I'm not offended that I was mistaken for an economy passenger. I'm offended that I had to prove I belonged just because my skin is different." She looked at no one in particular, but her words landed squarely on the hearts of every person who had smirked, stayed quiet, or turned away because it wasn't their problem. A seat doesn't define a person. But how you react to someone in that seat defines you. What happened here wasn't a personal error. It was the product of a rotten system where bias hides behind policy and discrimination is disguised as procedure. Some bowed their heads, others stared out the window, but none turned away in indifference anymore. They turned away in shame. And if any of you think this is just a matter between two women, wake up. This is a matter of a generation, a test for an entire industry, a warning to anyone who thought disdain could be a valid way to judge another human being. She paused. Alicia turned to the captain who had announced the emergency landing. I am the CEO of Monroe Air, and starting today our entire system will be rewritten. No one dared laugh, because that wasn't a statement, it was a command. I will retrain every crew member across our network. Every employee will be re-evaluated not just by technical skill, but by moral integrity. Complaint handling procedures will be transparent, open, and leave no grey area for prejudice to hide in. Then a single clap broke the silence from seat 3, Marcus Bennett. It wasn't loud or theatrical, just a nod from someone who had seen enough hypocrisy to recognize when a person was speaking from the heart. Applause spread, not quickly but steadily. Cheryl Adams, who once whispered a cruel remark, was now the first to cry. And Alicia, she didn't smile, she didn't cry. She added one last sentence, not to close the confrontation, but to open a new chapter. We cannot build luxury on a foundation of prejudice. If I must choose between serving the wealthy and the dignified, I choose the latter. And from this day forward, anyone boarding my aircraft will be treated with respect, without needing to prove who they are. The atmosphere in the cabin slowly transformed. Gone was the oppressive air of bias. In its place, a sacred stillness born of awakening. Alicia never asked for applause, but she received it. She never demanded recognition. But now she no longer needed to introduce herself, because from that moment forward, no one would dare forget her name again. 3 days after the incident, the entire room paused momentarily when Alicia Monroe, wearing a minimalist white suit, entered the CBS studio. Not because she made a dramatic entrance, but because everyone already knew who she was this time without needing an introduction. In front of her were millions of viewers watching live on national television. Her story had spread like a silent explosion. No scandal, no sensationalism, just the truth revealed at the right moment by the right person in the right way. The host, a seasoned, serious white woman, looked at Alicia with a rare respect seldom seen on national airwaves. Ms. Monroe, millions have seen the video from the flight. Millions more are still sharing every word you said. But I have to ask, when you were slapped, why didn't you retaliate? Why didn't you react? Why didn't you shout? Alicia didn't need time to think. Because I don't need to respond the way they expect me to, she replied. When a black woman pushes back against disrespect, they call it rage. When she's quiet, they call it weakness. But no one can label her when she stands tall without retreating, screaming, or backing down. They're forced to see her as a person. Social media erupted. The hashtags #respect is standard and Alicia Monroe became global trends. Clips from the interview spread everywhere, from celebrities' Instagrams to student TikToks to professional forums where flight attendants began questioning their industry. A day later, the Monroe Air homepage released an official video with no background music or graphics, just Alicia sitting before the camera. I'm not doing this to be praised. I'm doing this because I don't want anyone else to stay silent like I once did. Respect isn't a reward for the famous. Respect is the standard, and if we have to wait until someone reveals they own the airline before they're treated properly, then maybe the service industry is serving the wrong people. In less than an hour, the video reached 2 million views. Dozens of other airlines were named in the comment stories, once buried, now rising into the light. The system could no longer hide behind the phrase internal policy. And then the unexpected happened. A group of former flight attendants launched the hashtag Crew for Change campaign, exposing internal briefings where staff were subtly reminded that VIP passengers were typically white. A civil rights organization invited Alicia to serve as an honorary advisor. A prestigious law school asked her to deliver the commencement address, with the theme, "Silence is also an action, but whose action is it?" and Heather Collins. She remained silent, no statements, no appearances. Her name faded beneath headlines, like a lesson no one wanted to speak but none dared forget. And Alicia, she didn't write a memoir. She didn't release a documentary. She did the simplest thing: she listened to the thousands of emails pouring in from people who had been sidelined, mistaken for help, or refused service simply because they didn't look right. Alicia replied with a single line: "You don't need to be known to be respected. You need to stand firm and refuse to bow to injustice. Not everyone has the power to reform an airline." But Alicia reminded the world of something more profound. You don't need power to make the world take notice. You need to refuse to bow. 3 weeks after the day America collectively spoke her name, and Alicia Monroe stood again at the airport. But this time not in the shadow of a brewing storm inside a cabin. This time in the clear light of a world that had finally paused to reflect on itself. In front of her was a jet bearing the Monroe Air logo, elegant, understated, and now known not only as a luxury airline, but as a symbol of something greater. A new standard, a promise, a truth that could no longer be undone. Alicia ascended the metal steps into the cabin. No sunglasses, no effort to avoid stares. Her face was calm, composed, as if the uprising 3 weeks ago had been inevitable. And when the cabin door opened, the person waiting to greet her was not wearing a plastic smile, but a look of genuine respect. "Welcome back, Ms. Monroe," the young flight attendant said with a bow not out of obligation, but sincere reverence. "It's an honor to serve you today." Alicia nodded. "Thank you. But remember, I don't need special service. I only need proper service." Today the cabin held no judgment, no scanning eyes, no one priced passengers by their clothing or their skin. Instead, there were open faces, sincere greetings, and a gentle silence, not out of fear, but respect. Alicia took her seat, still 2A. But no one approached her to ask if she belonged there, and that was the actual change. The sky unfolded blue and wide outside the window like an unspoken promise. The plane rolled forward. Alicia fastened her seatbelt, glancing across the aisle at the boarding passengers. A young black boy, seated beside his father, looked up at her. His eyes sparkled, not because he recognized her, but because he saw someone like himself in the front row. She smiled at the boy. He said nothing, just nodded like a quiet vow. "Someday I'll sit there too. And I won't have to prove anything." As the plane lifted off, Alicia leaned back into her seat. She didn't think about the slap. She didn't know about Heather Collins. She thought about the people who wrote to her saying, "Because of you, someone finally listened." She thought of frontline workers undergoing new training, learning to pour wine and seeing people beyond prejudice. She thought of the next generation of kids of all colors, black, brown, yellow, and white, who won't need to rise above bias, but instead grow up in a world where respect is the default. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached cruising altitude. Thank you for choosing Monroe Air, where everyone is served equally." Alicia closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to hold still in her mind. A moment she once thought impossible. A flight, a greeting, a seat. Everything is the same as before, except for one thing. This time, The world had learned to look a black woman in the eye, without lowering it through prejudice. You don't need power to change the world. You need to stand firm. And when you refuse to give up your seat, the entire system is forced to rise.